So the book that I've had the most trouble with in my ministry is understanding the book of Revelation. I remember reading it as a child and not understanding all these crazy images of monsters and something rising up out of the sea and all these different heads on a monster. But I remember learning that apocalyptic literature is a special kind of literature that uses all this imagery, and it means something to the people of that day. It was a very widely understood type of writing. And so when I started to read it that way, I started to see the great message of hope that was given to the people who were persecuted during that time. So that helped me a whole lot with a difficult book to understand.
Mine's similar. I also have trouble with apocalyptic literature. Visions to prophets in the Old Testament, like Zechariah, when he's talking about there's this lamp and there's 2 olive trees and the oil is flowing into the lamp. And I'm like, what on earth is this about? But it's about hope oftentimes, and also I think it's okay that there's mystery there, that there's mystery about how God reveals God's self to us, to Israelites, to prophets, to other people, and that we recognize that we recognize that this is one way that God speaks to us, and we can try to interpret it, and we can read it for what it is and let it be.
I actually have a different answer. The one that I kind of have the hardest time with is the book of Job. And I think it's because Job is so mysterious. It's so, it's kind of the point of Job is that there are no easy answers. And I love answers. I love solving problems. I love puzzles. And I don't like when there's not an answer. And I know Job means a lot of things to a lot of people. But for me, I'm like, I don't like being confronted with that very true reality that life doesn't have easy answers. I like my answers, and it frustrates me when there aren't. So, yeah. I think the book of Scripture that's meant the most to me is the book of Genesis, like right in the beginning, because it tells us the origin of things, and it's really story focused. I love stories, and those stories in Genesis have always really spoken to me. This idea that there's a single family that God is dealing with, but that this family and God's relationship with this family has implications for all of humankind. I think that really something that I can pull a lot of meaning out of, because I can think, okay, God might be doing something with me, and that might actually extend beyond myself.
When I was pregnant with child number 3, I had a difficult pregnancy, and I remember thinking, I don't know what will happen. I don't know how this will all turn out. And I remember reading in the book of Daniel chapter 3, about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they were in the fiery furnace. And I'm going to totally quote this out of context, but I remember that what they said when confronted by what is it that you believe? And they said, we will not bow down to you. Mm-hmm. Whether God chooses to save us or whether God doesn't, God is still God. And so that made such an impact on me, that whatever the fiery furnace is in our world or in our personal lives, that God is still God. God will be faithful. No matter what the circumstances are in life, God will be faithful to us.
I often think about Paul's letters to the early Christians. A lot of them are legalistic and hard to understand, but I imagine this early disciple writing to these early churches that were meeting in homes. They were groups of friends and people, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to be Christians. What did that life look like? And so many of his letters deal with what is Christian holiness? What is Christian life? What is communion? Like the Holy Supper. What does that look like? How are we going to live? And imagine these people reading these letters in these homes together. Most of them wouldn't have been able to read, so it would have been read out loud to them. Like, to me, there's such a vision of those early Christians reading these letters from Paul and the other early Christian leaders.
I really like thinking about the book of Proverbs. The older I get, the more I appreciate these nuggets of wisdom that have been passed down from generation to generation. Growing up, I didn't always think my parents had a lot of sense. Those teenage years are hard, aren't they? But I appreciate so much their wisdom that they passed down, and I think that's what the book of Proverbs is for me. It's these people who lived lives of faith that desperately wanted to make life easier as the people who would follow them and the people whom they taught learned to live in response to their faith and learned who God is. Mm-hmm. So those little nuggets that are so pithy, I think are helpful. As the older I get, the more I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Next to it is, I love the book of Psalms. When we are feeling happy or sad, wherever you're at, there is a psalm that's a prayer to God. Like, when you don't have the words for a prayer to God, it's there in Psalms. It's, create in me a clean heart, or God, I so praise you for all of your good creation, or, Lord, why is this happening? It's all there, and you can just start to read it, and those can be your prayers, those can be your devotions. And for me, that's really practical.
I think for me, my favorite part of Scripture is always the stories. Most of the ones in the Old Testament, but the New Testament too. And I think for me, those are actually really practical because they show you an example of what life with God looks like, the bad and the good, and it can be really life-giving to try to find yourself in those stories and to say, who am I? Who do I identify with in this moment? Who serves a good example for me? Who's a bad example that I don't want to follow? And so kind of reading those stories and spending time with them and internalizing them, I have found to be actually a very, very practical part of my faith because I can kind of draw on those stories to help me make sense of whatever's going on in my life, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think one place I've found an unexpected source of wisdom is the story of Moses, when Moses goes to Pharaoh. And I expected to find wisdom there, but I didn't expect to find the particular kind of wisdom that I found there. I remember Moses hears this incredible call from God, and Moses goes to Pharaoh. First of all, Moses doesn't want to do it, but God reassures him. So finally Moses goes, and Moses does exactly what God told him to do. And then Pharaoh made life worse for the Israelites. And then Moses brings this to God and says, God, I did what you told me to do. And God says, essentially, go do it again. And I thought that was the most faithful thing Moses ever did, was he tried again. And that is not the lesson I expected to find in that story, but it's one that really has resonated with me. It gives me the courage, the persistence to try again. Even if you did it exactly right the first time and it didn't work out, have the courage to try again.
Mm-hmm. I think about Queen Esther and how she had the courage to speak out in a situation where she could have been harmed. But she was really coached by her friend and her mentor who said to her, maybe it's for such a time as this that you were placed here. And, I'm somebody who doesn't necessarily want to speak out against authority. I have a pretty healthy respect for authority and, would sit and say, maybe this isn't such a great idea. Like, if we look at a pro-con list of what could happen in this situation. But she had wisdom and she had courage. And look at what happened. Like, God used her for salvation, for people, for the Jewish people. And so I see wisdom in her choosing to listen to the advice of her mentor, listen to the call of God, and speak out.
Wow. You know, I think Esther is one of my favorite stories from the scripture. It also makes me think about some other women in the Bible, Mary and Martha. And I always think Martha gets a bad rap. I mean, who's not going to get things ready for Jesus who's coming to dinner? Not fair. But if you look deeper in that story and you look at what Mary chose to do, she realized that in the busyness of everything else, that to sit at the feet of Jesus, to learn and to absorb who he was, and to take advantage of that moment in the presence of the one who is holy. That was so vital. And I don't think it's a lesson for women or a moral tale for us to all understand, don't be too busy. But I do think it is important for me, the wisdom I get from it is, when you are in the presence of the Holy One, when you are in God's church, when you are with people who are gathered, when you are learning, do not miss the opportunity to be touched by God. Do not miss that opportunity.
I think I would have to say my most favorite character in the Bible is Mary, Mother of God. I mean, there's so much artwork. I mean, humanity has been captured by Mary for centuries. Like, there's so much artwork of Mary. There's so many stories. Like, just this young woman who said yes. An angel came, and she said yes, yes, I will. And then her Magnificat, she sings about it in Luke. I mean, and then she sort of walks. We see bits and pieces of her throughout Scripture all the way up until Christ's death and resurrection. And so this mother who gave birth to this little child who changed the world and got to see him grow up and then grieved and exalted, just her whole story just captures me.
I never have a very good answer to this question, because at different points in my life, I relate to different biblical characters. As we read the Bible, that's why we read it over and over again, because you always find God speaking to you, and you always find yourself at a different point of the story throughout our lives. Lately, I've really been identifying with Andrew. And Andrew is not mentioned very many times in the Bible, but what he was known for was saying to his brother, hey, come here and see this guy. And it happened to be Jesus. I've found this person. And so that's what he's renowned for. And I think how powerful that is, and how often we forget to just, we don't have to deliver the whole message ourselves. We just get to say, hey, I want you to see what I've found. I want you to hear. I want you to be a part. I want you to experience this, and let God do the rest. So I think that's a wonderful reminder for me as a Christian, and me as a leader in a church, that just bring people to Christ. Let God do the rest.
Mm-hmm. I think my answer is probably Joseph in the Old Testament. I feel like I'm like spending all of my answers in the first two books of the Bible. But I really I've studied the story of Joseph a lot, and there's a reason for that. I really identify with that character in a lot of ways. This guy who had such an important relationship with his family, and really struggled to integrate that relationship with his family with his larger experiences, his larger calling. I think that just has a word for all of us as we kind of move into life and really try to think about our past and think about our future and how those look like together. So I've really always resonated with the story of Joseph and his experiences, both with his family and in Egypt. Yeah.